Hey guys, Bartell's Bookshelf here with my top reads of 2023 video. I meant to get this out around December 31st or January 1st. I wanted to get it out right at the beginning of the new year, but I ended up getting sick. So I had to put it off for a few days, but here I am now. 2023 was a pretty good reading year for me. I found a lot of new favorites and a lot of interesting ones that I wouldn't have expected. I'm not presenting these in any particular order. These are all just in chronological order as I read them. Consequently, most of the books on this list are ones that I haven't talked about previously because I was taking a break from BookTube at the time, but towards the end we'll get into ones that I've already talked about, so I won't spend too much time on those. I'll link you to any relevant videos. But yeah, let's get into it. So, number 1 on my top reads of 2023, we're going from 1 to 10, and remember, this is in no particular order. Number 1 is Books of Blood, volumes 3 through 6 by Clive Barker. I read the Sphere Omnibus edition, so I'm counting it all as one book. Yeah, this was incredible. I've talked about Clive Barker endlessly on this channel. He's one of my favorite authors. Especially his short stories. I think his short stories are brilliant. They're so macabre and gothic and imaginative and strange and sexual. And I'd read the first omnibus, Books of Blood omnibus, ages and ages ago, like 2017, I think. And I always meant to get to the rest of the stories, but I never did until this year, and I'm so glad I did, because they were just so... It just reminded me how refreshing and interesting and imaginative he was. And reading his short stories, his earliest writings, really makes you realize why or how other people like Stephen King sort of saw him as the future of horror, because while the stories all, share similar themes and ideas, as they do with lots of authors, the way that they're written and they're so diverse in terms of their tones and their genres and the way that they explore things, that it must have felt like back in the day that Clive Barker could do almost anything. And some of the stories in this collection, even compared to the first omnibus, are just outright bizarre. One of the most infamous ones is The Body Politic, which is about people's hands just all of a sudden deciding to rebel against their bodies, chopping themselves off of people's arms and running off and starting a revolt. This was just a great piece of just surreal weirdness. It reminded me a little bit of Nikolai Gogol's The Nose and stuff like that. It was just really crazy and bizarre and imaginative. And that's the thing that I love about Clive Barker, is that in his best fiction, it feels endless. It feels like you've only scratched the surface of things. It's that thing that I love. It's that mixing of horror and beauty and kind of mashing it together and sort of churning it until it's all one entity. It's just so beautiful and so well done. One of my other favorite stories in this collection was The Age of Desire, which is about a laboratory experiment to experiment on the human libido, and they end up turning their test subject into basically an insane, lustful creature of just sex and desire, and it's very graphic, but it's also very just over the top and crazy. But he has lots of subtle moments, too. Lots of subtle atmospheric moments, like The Forbidden, which was the short story that was eventually adapted into Candyman. And the short story is... I love the movie, and after reading the short story, you can really see how incredibly faithful it was. Obviously, the movie expanded on things because it's a short story, but so much of what's in the movie was right there in the story. The travel to Cabrini Green, sweets for the sweet, so much, and be my victim, so much of the ideas and the imagery was already there in the story. So it was just really amazing to see it, kind of where it came from, and to see how faithful it was to the original story. I think I once heard Will Erickson on Too Much Horror Fiction describe this as the best story that Ramsey Campbell never wrote, and I can definitely see that. It has that sense of like urban decay and of things being just slightly off kilter, of urban legends and things like that. And of course, there's Twilight at the Towers, which is a werewolf story with spies. That was a really good one. But there's other ones that I had that hadn't really like gained any sort of reputation. That ended up being some of my favorite stories in the collection, like the Madonna, which involves this mysterious sort of abandoned pool complex with this Madonna-like creature residing inside of it with this sort of feminine cult. And that had a lot of interesting stuff about like gender bending and sort of accepting your transformation. And that's one of the other things I love about Clive Barker, is that he has this constant theme of transformation and monstrousness, and how maybe becoming something apart from yourself isn't necessarily such a bad thing. There's this idea that the monstrous is something that should be embraced and celebrated, and I think this particular story does that really well. So yeah, a great collection. I highly recommend it. If you've never read Clive Barker before, start with the Books of Blood, read all of them, and if you like them, then you can move on to the novels. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Number 2 on my list of top reads is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This is another one of those big fantasy tomes that I'd heard a lot about, that has been incredibly well regarded, lauded with praise. And I was always intimidated by it because of its length and its complexity. But I finally read it this year, and oh my god, I loved it. This was so good. Basically, it's sort of a fictional alternate history of England where magic used to exist, but it's kind of been gone for a little while. It's kind of lapsed into history and textbooks and that kind of thing. And most people who call themselves magicians really don't practice magic. They just study it intensively. And then this mysterious man comes along, Mr. Norrell, who claims to be the only man truly practicing magic. And indeed, he puts some of his magical ideas into practice, and that leads to the interest of a younger man, Jonathan Strange, who wants to be trained in magic. And it kind of follows their relationship and Jonathan Strange's sort of upbringing and mentorship along with Mr. Norrell as they try to sort of bring about an English renaissance of magic. This book was fantastic. It's very long, it's very dense, there's lots of footnotes, but it's dense in the way that it makes the world feel bigger and bolder and more detailed. It makes it feel more real. I just loved all the little historical details. That's primarily what the footnotes are. It goes into more of this like sort of fictional history of England, talking about the mysterious Raven King, who was sort of like this lord of all magic who disappeared mysteriously. It goes into the history of fairies and the interaction of humans with fairy. It goes into some of the opposing views on magic from various contemporary magicians of the time. It's just so detailed, and I loved that. It was almost like reading a textbook, but like a really well-written, interesting one, if you know what I mean. And there's other things too, like there's a lot of deeper themes about sort of colonialism and getting into more of like the national British identity type thing. There's stuff about sort of old versus new scholarship. Mr. Norrell has very stringent ideas about magic and how magic should be practiced, and Jonathan Strange is kind of the young upstart who starts out being his protege and then eventually kind of surpasses him in a lot of ways, and they end up kind of coming to not coming to blows, but coming to disagreements over the application of magic. And it's just really interesting. And even aside from that, one of the other things I really liked about it was that it's very much written in a very like 19th, 18th century style, including spellings like connections with an X and things like that. But it has these very visceral moments of like horror and imagination as well. For example, there's a scene where a bunch of statues talk and come to life. There's another scene where Jonathan Strange during the Napoleonic Wars, he raises up some dead soldiers, and it's like surprisingly horrific and gruesome. It just completely came out of left field, and I really liked that. There's a bunch of great stuff about fairies and stuff. One of the main sort of antagonists is this mysterious fairy who's only known as like the gentleman, and he is very much like your sort of like puckish figure who kind of steps into things and sows little seeds of chaos around, and that kind of leads to one of the main conflicts in the book. Yeah, just something about all of these disparate elements just came together and just produced a really fun, exciting, very pacey book for me that really didn't feel like over 1,000 pages at all. I mean, I just flew through it. It was so imaginative and so much fun, and the prose is just beautiful. I mean, it captures that 19th, 18th century style without being too dry. It has lots of moments of beautiful poeticism. Yeah, I just loved this book. I was really, it's one of those things where for me it definitely lived up to the hype. I really, really loved it, and I definitely want to get on to her second novel, Piranesi, at some point, especially because that one's a lot shorter. But again, similarly, that one has been critically lauded, so I really need to read that one at some point. Next on my list, I have Carnivorous Lunar Activities by Max Booth III. One guess as to why I bought this book. I've talked about it before. I have a thing for werewolves, if you don't know. And I read this sort of during a time where I was just like, man, I just want to read a werewolf book. I don't want to have to think about anything. And I had this. I don't remember where. I think I found this at half price just randomly. And of course, when I run across werewolf books that I've never heard of that sound intriguing, I have to pick them up. So I picked this one up. This one's about two friends, Ted and Justin, who have been estranged for a while. As sort of high school friends do. You sort of drift apart as the years go by. But Justin eventually reaches out to Ted, asking for help. And he spins this mysterious story of, not being able to sleep at night, waking up covered in blood. And he believes that he has become a werewolf, and he wants his best friend to kill him. And the bulk of this novel is just over a single night as Justin tries to convince Ted that he is a werewolf, and as Ted basically slowly comes to realize, or at least debate with himself, is his friend insane? Is he truly a werewolf? And along that way, it goes into sort of the nature of friendship, of male friendship, the power of male friendship, why friends become estranged from each other, how you can go from being basically someone's soulmate to not knowing them at all, and sort of how that closeness can be deeper even than romantic relationships in a lot of ways. It's very much a very heavily bromance focused book, which is one of the things I really liked about it. It was not something I expected out of what I thought was just going to be a silly werewolf novel. It really went into sort of the male friendship and just the depth and the complexity of it. And one of the things that I liked about Max Booth III's writing is how he really captured kind of the camaraderie between old friends. There's a lot of the ribbing and the jokes and stuff, lots of gay jokes and things like that. But he kind of digs into that and finds sort of the deeper love underneath all of that kind of lighthearted ribbing, And on top of that, it was just a very grimy, very almost like grindhousey read a little bit. It's not really overtly, it's not grindhouse in the sense that, there's lots of blood and sex and violence and stuff, but it's just kind of the vibe of it. It just feels very grimy and grungy. Justin is living in his old family house, basically on his own. It's kind of fallen into disrepair. It's a bit grimy and gross, and on top of that, Ted is dealing with his own problems with his wife and things like that. So the whole thing of it just feels very very, very, very decay, urban decay in that, or something like that. You know what I mean? It just captures that atmosphere really well. And as I said, I went into this expecting it to just be kind of a silly werewolf novel, and I ended up getting this really surprisingly deep story about male friendship and love, and it was really, honestly, I found myself surprisingly moved by it in ways that I didn't expect to. As far as I know, Max Booth III is fairly new on the horror scene, but based on the strength of this, I really need to check out more of his stuff. I believe he has some short stories, and I think a few other novels. I'll have to look more into it, but yeah, based on this, I was really impressed. And without spoiling anything, when we do get to some werewolf action, it's very, very satisfying, and it picks up the pace and becomes much more action oriented than the last 75% of the book. So, but it doesn't feel unearned. It doesn't feel out of place. It feels like it was all leading up to this point, and the way that it resolves, I think, was also very beautiful and tied in with the previously laid-in themes of the book. So yeah, if you like werewolves and bromance, I highly recommend this one. I really enjoyed it. Number 4 on my list is A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. I probably don't need to talk about this. Lots of people have read it, or at least heard of it. V.E. Schwab is an immensely popular author. I had read her book, Vicious, a long time ago, and I really liked it, but I'd never read anything of hers since then. But Laura and Nakia recently read this whole trilogy. And so we kind of buddy read this first one, and then they went on and read the rest of the trilogy. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. It's basically about this young man named Kel, and he's a magician of sorts who he's of a specific race of people who has this magical ability to travel between alternate dimensions. There's 4 dimensions. There's Red London, White London, Grey London, and Black London. Grey London is basically our world, with some minor sort of enhancements and fantastical things here and there. Magic is not widespread. People are living pretty normal lives. White London is almost like a dictatorship with these insane siblings that are ruling the throne together, who are often making deals with Kel because he can flip between worlds. And Red London is the one where Kel is from, where magic is more sort of all-consuming. It's your kind of typical fantasy world with a king and a queen and castles, and he's been sort of adopted by the king and queen, and he has a brother, sort of an adoptive brother named Rai, who is the prince, to become the king. He's always kind of getting Rai out of scrapes and things like that. And into this mix comes a thief from Grey London named Delilah Bard, who ends up falling in with Kel, and they end up traveling between the worlds to right a potentially apocalyptic wrong, which I won't get into. Yeah, this book was just a lot of fun. I wouldn't necessarily say it's not necessarily like super like deep or whatever. It's not very. I wouldn't call it literary or whatever. It's not something you go into if you want like a thinker. You know what I mean? But it's just a really good sort of rip-roaring adventure tale, and I loved all the details between the different universes. See, at first, you hear a book about 4 universes, and you think it'll get confusing, but they establish things so well and so quickly that I really just fell right into it. The rapport between Kel and Delilah is so much fun because they're both sort of thieves and smugglers in a way. Kel's thing is that he constantly smuggles things from other worlds into Grey London and sells them on to people and vice versa and that kind of thing. And Delilah is, a thief. So they kind of come from similar worlds, except Kel grew up in royalty, Delilah's from the streets, so they have this kind of like banter back and forth where she's kind of giving him shit for being privileged and things like that, and it's just really fun. And it's also just interesting the little details between the worlds, how White London is much more closed off and frightened because of the climate they live in, the sort of mundanity of Grey London, the sort of high fantasy ness of Red London. It was just really interesting and really entertaining, and there were just a lot of fun ideas, and there wasn't a lot of info dumping, which is something that really bugs me in a lot of genre fiction. The world building felt very natural and very imaginative. I loved the little hints that we get of how the magic works. Basically, the way that they have to use like items from the different worlds that they want to go into to be able to sort of open the door. Just little things like that. It was just a lot of fun, and it really stuck with me. I still need to read the second and third books. I'm borrowing Laura's copy of the second book, so I will get to it eventually, but you know how it is. There's so many goddamn things to read. I've read 2 V.E. Schwabs now, and I've liked them both immensely, so I really look forward to getting into more of her stuff. So yeah, I will complete that at some point. Number 5 on my list is The Dreaming Jewels by Theodore Sturgeon. I believe in 2023 I also read E Pluribus Unicorn by Theodore Sturgeon, one of his early short story collections, and that was another one I loved. I debated about whether I should put that on here. It could really go either way, but this was my first novel by Sturgeon, and he didn't write many novels. I think he only wrote about 6 or 7 novels. This isn't one of his more popular ones. Most people know him for More Than Human or Venus Plus X. But this really surprised me. I really enjoyed this. I mean, even knowing that I liked Sturgeon, I enjoyed this way more than I thought I was going to. So this is a sort of a fantasy kind of thing about a young boy who runs off to a circus after his father, beats and abuses him, and it's implied that he has some strange power of some sort that is part of the reason his father has this sort of animosity toward him. And he runs off to the circus, and at the circus he meets a few of the strange people, the little people, the lizard men, your typical sort of freak show sideshow fare. And he ends up striking up a friendship with them. And the ringleader of this circus is this sort of very nihilistic, piece of shit named Pierre Monetre, the man-eater. And he's just very nihilistic. He has these very all-or-nothing views about humanity. He seems to despise everybody and everything. But it turns out some of the people at the circus are themselves different in the same way that Horton, the main character, his name's Horty, is. And they decide to help him discover himself. There's a lot of other stuff going on that I don't want to get into for spoilers, but it gets very metaphysical, sort of a nature of the universe type stuff, reality bending type things. I was just surprised how much I liked this. It felt a lot with sort of the slightly fantastical vibes and the carnival setting. It felt a lot like Ray Bradbury, Something Wicked This Way Comes, that type of thing. But I think Sturgeon is a little bit more... he's a little bit less romantic than Bradbury. He's a little bit less... he sees the world with slightly sort of clearer eyes, I would say, which I think is kind of reflected in the character of Pierre Monetre, who isn't... He's a prick, he's an asshole, but you really get to understand him by the end of it, even if you don't necessarily agree with him or sympathize with him. And just the way that he touched on the kind of found family of Horton, with the little people and all the other ones that he meets throughout the book. It was just really beautifully done, and it just goes into it just goes into places that I didn't think it would go. It has some pretty interesting things to say about like gender and sort of the nature of reality and how sort of people can be molded to be whatever we wish to be. And it even actually turns out to be a really sweet little love story by the end, which was something that I didn't expect, but it was really beautiful. It was this really beautiful little moment of humanity that kind of culminated at the end of the story, and I really enjoyed that. It's a quiet book. It's not it's not full of action and rip-roaring suspense, but it was just so... Sturgeon writes with such a clear eye and such imagination and so much compassion for his characters that they really go beyond just being archetypes, I think, and they become fully rounded people, and you really care about them by the end of the book, or at least I did. Like I said, there's a lot of other sort of metaphysical stuff that I don't really want to get into for spoilers, but the main thing that I came away with was just the atmosphere of sort of the carnival setting and the empathy for all the characters and how they came alive for me, and I found myself really moved by it at the end. So yeah, I highly enjoyed that one, and I definitely need to read more Sturgeon this year. I have tons of Sturgeon to get through. I have a copy of More Than Human and Venus Plus X, and I want to get more of his short stories because he's turning out to be, I think, one of my favorite genre writers of that time period. I can see why he's so well regarded. I love his stuff. So yeah, that was a great one. Next, I have a piece of nonfiction. I don't read a lot of nonfiction, or at least not as much as I should, but I read a few this year, and this one was by far my favorite. This is Secret Historian by Justin Spring. This is a biography of the little-known queer writer Samuel Steward, who wrote under various pen names, most notably Phil Andros, under which he wrote a lot of erotic fiction and short stories and novels and things. But he also worked under the name Phil Sparrow, under which he wrote a series of essays for a local dental magazine. And he worked primarily as a school teacher, as a college professor in Chicago and other places. But he was a closeted gay man in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. During the time when being gay was not a very safe thing to be. As he was teaching his students, he led a double life as this incredibly open, at least as out as you could be, gay man, a voracious sexual appetite. He kept an entire box of every sexual conquest he ever had, which he called the stud file, and he ended up working closely alongside Alfred Kinsey during his human sexuality studies. They even did some they ran some experiments together. Kinsey took some pictures of Samuel Steward's escapades, and alongside that, he was also an author of erotic gay fiction, writing novels under the name Phil Andros, one of which I read earlier this year, which was how I got into him. My Brother, Myself, a very educated man. He was very interested in literature. He was a big fan of like Jean Genet and other French authors like that. He was very well read. He was very close friends with Gertrude Stein. Actually, they were basically like close friends right up until her death. And he met tons of other queer luminaries of the time, Thornton Wilder, André Gide, a bunch of other queer authors. He had an immensely interesting life, and this book catalogs all of that. And on top of that, he was also a very early proponent of sort of the leather scene. He was kind of a part of that before that was ever really codified, as you can see in the photos on the book and on the cover and throughout the book. He was very much into sailors and cops and men in uniform. Kind of before that whole leather scene was codified. He was very much into S&M. And he was just this very important queer literary figure that nobody knew about, really. His erotic novels were pretty popular when they were originally published, and they were republished in the 80s by Allison Publications, of which the version of My Brother, Myself I read was a reprint. But these days, he doesn't really seem that well known. In fact, at the time I'm making this video, none of his stuff has been reprinted except for his nonfiction material, and a big part of that is because of this book. Justin Spring was meticulous in going through every piece of paper relating to Samuel Steward that he could find, and he spoke with tons of his old friends and things. It's a meticulously detailed book, and it really is a snapshot of that time, in the early to mid 20th century when gay culture would kind of had to develop underground, and it wasn't really something you could just easily bring out to people, but it was everywhere, and I don't know, it just really resonated with me as somebody who feels it's super important to be aware of queer history and to sort of learn as much as we can, to learn from our forebears. It's just something that I feel very strongly about, and Sam Steward was such an interesting lyrical person. He was well educated. He was erudite. He was funny. He was unabashedly sexual. He just seemed like a fascinating person, and I wish I could have known him. And I hoped that, because this book was published in 2010, and it won the National Book Award that year, or it was nominated, I believe. But that, surprisingly, that didn't lead to any kind of resurgence in Sam Stewart's works. His Phil Andros fiction is still impossible to find. Even the reprints are ridiculously expensive, upwards of $50, even more than that, depending on the edition. But there were publications of his autobiography, which was previously unpublished, which I also read and was great. And I also read his book of essays as Phil Sparrow, which is quoted frequently in the autobiography and throughout the book, so it's a little bit of an afterthought. But I was just so fascinated with him because, as I said, I read My Brother Myself, which was just looked like a piece of just, gay erotic bullshit that Nakia found at a library sale for $2, and I had no idea. And I read it, and it was fun and lyrical and sexy, and it was surprisingly really good and entertaining. And that led to me looking into who's this Phil Andros guy, and through that I found this biography, and I read all of the supplementary stuff. And I would love to read more of his fiction, but it's so hard to find, unfortunately. But until then, I think if you're interested at all in gay history and in the development of human sexuality, studies of S&M, if you're just interested in queer literature, I really think you owe it to yourself to learn more about this guy and to educate yourself and to I don't know, sort of find a new gay grandfather is kind of how I think of him. He was just an eminently fascinating person, and it's just sad that most of the world seems to have forgotten about him. So yeah, this book was great. I've been really rambly about it. I just, as usual, it's tough to put all my thoughts in order, but I just really enjoyed this book, and I highly recommend it. And the supplementary stuff, his autobiography and the book of essays, if you can find them, they're wonderful reads. He was very lonely and sort of down on himself a lot, but it didn't reflect a lot in his writing. He was so light and funny and airy, and just, he had so much joie de vivre. At least that's the impression that I got from reading all these books. So yeah, I highly recommend that one. Great book. And speaking of gay smut, the next book on my list is Wolfsong by T.J. Klune. I actually read the reprint that was put out recently by Tor, because T.J. Klune started out, again, as kind of just sort of a male romance, sort of erotic fiction author. And I remember seeing his stuff back in the day published by like Dream Spinner Press and things like that. And, all of a sudden in the last few years, he's become this huge critical darling. He wrote, House on the Cerulean Sea, Under the Whispering Door, The Lives of Puppets. And so now a lot of his earlier stuff is being reprinted in these gorgeous hardcover editions. The main reason I wanted to read these editions instead of just the regular ebooks or the earlier ones that you could get online is because these hardcovers are so beautiful. They're so lavish, and that cover art, man, is so incredible. By Red Nose Studio, who's one of my favorite artists. But yeah, this is a gay werewolf novel about a guy named Oxnard Matheson, or Ox for short, whose father leaves when he's a young boy. When he's a little bit older, he meets this new family moves in called the Bennetts, and they're very strange and mysterious. The youngest son, Joe, becomes really attached to him. And over time, as he sort of gets to know them, he learns they're werewolves. And this book sort of follows the relationship of Joe and Ox as they start out as friends, and then as they get older, friendship blossoms into romance, and about sort of the struggles of their relationship to stay together amidst everything that's going on. Again, werewolf fan, I was obligated to read this book. And I'm really glad I did. I loved it. It's one of those things where you go into it thinking like, oh, it's, male romance. It'll just be kind of like fluffy and whatever, No, this book is dark, really dark. It goes into a lot of themes of, child abuse and trauma and death and grief, being estranged. There's just so much going on, but it's so beautifully written. And it really, for me anyway, it really tapped into that sort of classic werewolf theme of, of pack, of family. The Bennetts, despite everything that happens to them, despite all of the shit they go through, their family, and that includes people like Ox and his mother, and his friends, people who aren't necessarily blood related. You don't have to be blood related to be pack. And Laura, who's read a bunch of T.J. Klune's other books, says that's kind of a recurring theme in his novels, that feeling of found family, and I think it was done really well in this book, and it works especially well because, they're werewolves, there's pack. It really tapped into the mentality of being a werewolf really well, that feeling of pack, of brotherhood, of togetherness, and of loving the wild, of running through the forest, of being free. It was just something that I really loved. And the romance is beautiful, too. You start out thinking, like, it might be a little squicky, because Ox is 16 when the Bennett family moves in, and Joe is, like, 9 or 10. But the progression of the relationship, the way that he writes it, it feels so natural. And it goes into a lot of the anxieties that Ox feels, because Joe is younger. Obviously he's legal at the point when they're, romantically involved, but he's still younger, so there's that kind of power imbalance there that he worries about. And just the way all that was handled, one of the things I love about a good romance novel, well, one of the things I hate about romance novels is when they manufacture conflict out of, characters, like, saying stupid things, or it's like, this could have been resolved with a conversation. I hate that in romance novels. But the thing that I loved about this book is that the conflict feels earned, and it makes sense. It's logical. It's heart-wrenching. It's not easy for them, and it makes sense why it's not easy for them. It's about how, despite the fact that all this bad shit happens to them, they remain committed, or at least they try to remain committed. And even though, they do love each other, they're very committed to each other, they have issues, they have problems, there's things they have to work through. It's not a happily ever after. That was one of the things that I really liked about it, is that it really delved into the struggle of maintaining, a happy life. It just felt so powerful, and I really enjoyed it. Again, I'm rambling. There's so much more that I could talk about, but I really enjoyed this book. It was beautiful. And that's coming from someone who doesn't read a lot of romance. If you're not like a big romance fan, I would give this a try, because it's about a lot more than just the romance. It goes into Ox and Joe's life, and their upbringing, and how they came to be who they are. You really, really get to know them as characters before anything romantic even happens, and I really liked that. I liked that it was a slow burn, and that T.J. Klune took his time getting to where he was going. I don't think that's something you see a lot in romance novels, so I really enjoyed that. So yeah, it was just a great book. I loved it, and I really need to read the sequels, so yeah. Number 8 is Like People in History by Felice Picano. I learned how to pronounce it properly since my last video. I talked about this in a previous video, in a wrap-up. This was a really great, epic, gay novel about two friends and their sort of a combative relationship over many, many, many decades. And through that, it kind of uses them as sort of a microcosm of the entire gay community and gay history. It was a wonderful book. It was very lyrically written. There's some beautiful passages about, the struggle with AIDS, and of wanting to, go out with a bang and not with a whimper. All the various facets of gay culture that he touched on throughout the various parts of the book were just really, really believable, and really, they felt lived in. They felt like he'd been there. This was just a really good book. I really liked it. I need to read more of Felice's work. I have a bunch of his other books, so I will get to that eventually. But if you want to hear more about it, I'll link to my video. Number 9 is The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. Again, talked about this in a wrap-up video. I think the same one, actually, with Like People in History. This was an author, I mentioned in my video, this came completely out of nowhere. I'd never heard of this author, never heard of this book. I just found this randomly at half price, and this blew me away. This was a YA novel about a young girl who was dealing with some mysterious secrets of her family, and that may be connected to this book of fairy tales that her grandmother wrote, called Tales from the Hinterland. This is wonderful, wonderful YA fantasy, lyrical, poetic, in the vein of something like Neil Gaiman or Angela Carter. Very dark, grim, sort of gothic fantasy, with just lovely themes about, autonomy and sort of writing your own story, escaping from generational trauma. And on top of that, the writing was just beautiful, and the writing itself was very poetic and fairy tale-esque. I just really enjoyed this book, and I need to read the sequel and the book of short stories that she actually wrote after the book. So, but yeah, this was complete out of left field, and I love it when books can do that. I love when just a random thing that you can grab off the shelves is just completely whoa, Yeah, I loved this. This was great. We'll definitely be reading the sequels. But yeah, if you want to learn more about that, again, I'll link to the video. Then finally, the most recent read on this list, The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. Again, I talked about this more in depth in a recent video. But yeah, this was just a very dense, classic gothic ghost story written with sort of a modern lens about the dissolution of the landed gentry in England, about sort of the conflict between class structures, the reliance of memory. It was just so beautiful. It was so gothic, so atmospheric. The ending just blew me out of the water, how it just ended on such a quiet, powerful moment. Sarah Waters replicates the style that she's going for, the style of the period, so well. It was a very slow burn, a very slow read, but it went places I didn't expect it to, and it was wildly enjoyable because of that. It's dense, it's long, it's not exactly a very pacey book, but if you can get with its very wintry, spooky vibe, I think you'll really, really enjoy it. I really did, and again, I need to read more of Sarah Waters. I have Fingersmith, and I think I have Tipping the Velvet, so I really, really want to read more of that. So yeah, those are my top reads of 2023. Again, I know this video was a bit rambly, but sorry, like I said, I've been sick and it's been tough to organize my thoughts. And some of these books I'm talking about, I read, at the very beginning of the year, so it's a little bit hard to remember some of them, but these were just the ones that stayed with me the most, that I enjoyed the most, that I still think about. And yeah, I hope 2024 is even better. I have a lot of plans for 2024. I enjoyed my Christmas Ghosts video so much that I'm making plans for another video, a more in-depth video in a similar vein, but I don't want to give any spoilers. One, because I don't, want to hype things up too much, and I don't want to say that I'm working on a project and then have it come out, 2, 3, 4 months later, depending on how long this takes me. But yeah, so I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to more reads this year. I'm currently in the middle of my first Jules Verne, so I look forward to talking about that at some point. So, yeah, let's hope 2024 is a good one. But until then, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.